know, I'm so thankful to you guys for organizing this, because I think that, like, there's so much talk in the news these days about successful women, and there's calls to action to lean in, and there's talk of women in binders, and there's like proclamations that you can't have it all. And while I don't agree with all of it, I actually love it. Like, I love that this dialogue is getting a broader forum, and I'm just thankful to be a part of this discussion. And in addition to all of these like really smart people telling you what you should do, like that's not me. I don't know what you should do, but I do have a story that I'm pumped to tell you about. Because I do think that through stories, I think that's often how sort of the experiences and the stories that I have and the ones that you have are the ones that are going to shape sort of how you view all of these decisions as you guys sort of progress through all of your careers. And I'm particularly excited to share my storyline, sort of to share with you how I got here, but also some approaches that I've adopted that have helped me sort of enjoy the process in a way that has made my life fun. It's made my life fun, it's made my life more joyful, and frankly, I think it makes it better at what I do. So let's start. So me, in 1997, I got on a one-way flight to DC. I am a Filipino-Iranian girl with immigrant parents from the immigrant suburbs of LA. We never discussed politics in my family, but I strangely had an affinity for politics. So if you love entertainment, you move to LA. If you love finance, you move to New York. I love politics, so I moved to DC without knowing one successful, important person at all. But I had a place to live, so I met these people where I could sleep on their floor for $250 a month. I had another $250 in my bank account, and I thought I could totally make this happen. And so I literally walked onto Congressional Hill. Oh, and I wanted to be a press secretary. So that's CJ from The West Wing, but much less cooler. So I walked onto Capitol Hill, and I literally knocked on doors. And one thing that I learned really quickly through my conversations, you know, I met an intern, and his dad was a donor to such and such's campaign. And I met this other guy, and his uncle was this lobbyist, and he called the senator who got him the job. And I was like, oh, shit. Like, I don't actually know anyone who can help me do any of that. So what I did is I kept knocking on doors. And I met this woman named Adrienne McGillivray, who I'm pretty sure I just reminded her of herself at some point. She was a really important press person for the Ways and Means Committee. She then introduced me to a bunch of other people like Ari Fleischer, who I don't know if you recognize that name, but he was the press secretary for President Bush not too long after that. And I recall one of my most favorite meetings was this woman who was honestly offended that I thought I could get a job as a 21-year-old with no connections. And she was like, basically, come and work here for free. And at the end of the summer, maybe we'll give you a paid internship. And at the end of the year, like, maybe we'll let you help the press secretary with her job. And I smiled and I said thank you, and I walked away. And within a month, I got a job as the youngest press secretary on Capitol Hill for a freshman congressman from North Carolina who probably knew no better. But it was primarily based on these relationships. And what I found over the course of my time with him was, again, this kid with no connections, I ended up giving our chief of staff as well as our congressman access to meetings and access to discussions based on the relationships that I built over this short period of time, where my chief of staff, who was this Yale undergrad, NYU law school, really important chief of staff, didn't have. And that's when I learned this. You know, competence times relationships so significantly accelerates your opportunity relative to competence alone. I mean, competence is a baseline, but the reality is, or the reality that I learned there, and I think has been reinforced throughout my career, is it's simply not enough. A fun Sextus aside while we're at it, is I was on, just irrelevant to my story, but I'll tell you, there's a subway that they take between the Capitol and the Senate buildings. And I worked for a North Carolina congressman, and who was there but Senator Jesse Helms, who's like this icon, and I worked for a congressman from North Carolina. And I was with a colleague of mine, and he said, he was talking to the senator, and I was really nervous trying to figure out like what smart thing I was going to say, because they were talking small talk about some policy. And then he looks over at me and he's all, well, why don't you sit your pretty little thing right here? And I was like, and in my best Southern accent, which was really bad, I said, well, thank you, Senator, I would do that, but I might just break your legs. I appreciate the offer. And smiled, and I find it amusing, but it was one of those moments where, I mean, I was strangely clueless to like this gender dynamic. I grew up, like I said, in an immigrant suburb, so I was clueless to racial dynamics. And DC for me was a really eye-opening time where I started to see sort of much more how a lot of the expectations that people have based on how you might look. And so after that, I got recruited over to the McCain campaign, where I learned so much. I was his deputy press secretary, and every startup employee should be forced at some point in their career to work on a campaign. You work endless hours. It's super scrappy. The difference from a startup is people will berate you often, so you grow a really thick skin, which I found to be really useful in my career over time. And I especially learned that New Hampshire is super cold in the winter, and I would never move there. But when the campaign ended in 2000, I was forced with I had a choice. And, you know, should I stay in DC and sort of build this career as this political aide or not? And at the time, I was just really intrigued with what is this whole private sector thing? And to be honest, until then, I had very little interest and certainly very little understanding of how it all worked. But the things that intrigued me were, you know, how can these tobacco CEOs roll up to Capitol Hill and say that tobacco is as addictive as milk and like everyone's cool? Like, how do they have the power to be able to do that? This was 2000, so at the time every monitor on the Hill was watching CNBC. And so the other thing that intrigued me was like, what is all of this innovation happening in the Silicon Valley? Like, what is happening over there? How is that happening? And I wanted to be a part of it, but I frankly had zero insight into what someone with my skill set would do in the private sector. So I asked around, and I learned about this thing called public relations, which was not that dissimilar from what I was doing as a press secretary on Capitol Hill. I worked at this PR firm where I did consulting for venture capitalists, consultants, and bankers for 2 years, and I had a really great time. But after that two-year period, I had this sort of draw to get closer to the heart of like what is actually happening in the business. PR is powerful, and it is one of my favorite functions, but I wanted to get closer to the inside, and per my first learning on Capitol Hill, I figured I should meet some people who could help me figure it out. And so I went to Stanford. Go GSP. And I had a really interesting insight when I went to Stanford, because through this move to DC and jump around, a lot of people have insights about like what company they want to start and like what amazing innovation they want to bring to the world. And my big insight when I got to Stanford was I have hundreds of contacts, but I actually have no friends. Because I'd moved a number of times, and as I thought, interestingly, it made me reflect on my relationships and who am I going to be talking to 20 years from now as I'm making all of these decisions that I'm bound to make. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I made a commitment at the time to start building relationships, you know, which I think is sort of interesting as a business school insight. And when people ask me, what did you get out of business school? What are the best things that you got out of business school? The one thing that I mentioned, and it's always one of my top 3, is this thing called a WIM group. WIM stands for Women in Management. And I think it was formed at some point in Stanford in the 60s when there were even fewer women. although the proportion hasn't changed that much over time. And it facilitated women meeting on a monthly basis to talk. And so here's how it worked. There was this random cross-section of women who were put together, and every week we got together, and there were rules. There was a facilitator, no wine, and we talked. And I thought that was super weird. You know, like I've never done therapy. I thought it was very sort of it was really quite uncomfortable, to be honest. And what happened over that 2-year experience was I recognized very clearly that a lot of us were thinking about a lot of these decisions that you're reading about in the news today, right? Should I get the job that's the safe job so that I can have the long maternity leave? How do I manage this? And about the gender dynamics within something like business school. And now, 9 years later, I actually still have a WIM group that I meet with every month. And I can honestly say it is the best thing that I got out of Stanford. Because within this group, over the course of 9 years, we've gone through 9 marriages, 1 divorce, 15 kids, tons of career decisions. People have decided to do the stay-at-home mom route. People have decided to do the I'm going to be an entrepreneur route. And what it built for, what I've gotten out of that group is a really candid forum to be able to have the kind of discussions that are sort of hard to have, right? Whether that's like, how much should I negotiate for my salary? Which I hate to be so gender specific, but that happens to be something I'm not that good at. Like how am I going to manage this work-life thing, or dealing with interpersonal conflict at work? And what it provides me today is this really open, powerful forum, and I feel so enriched after I attend this every month. This forum of candor, where we're able to support one another, no matter what the decision is. And even if you don't agree with whatever that decision is. The takeaway that I hope you're hearing here is surround yourself with amazing people. And not just amazing people, but those where you can have these very candid, hard decisions around life and work and salary and conflict. Because I accidentally fell into it. And it's something that I sort of wish for everyone, and especially young women that I meet, because it's been so helpful to me. And so after Stanford, I made the worst career choice of my life, and I went to Morgan Stanley. I knew I would hate this job prior to ever starting. But interestingly, through business school, I tried what I thought would be my dream job, which I actually didn't like. I was a product marketer at Apple through the summer, and I actually didn't know what else to do. And so I ended up at Morgan Stanley in a private wealth management role, which is part investment management, but a very heavy part sales, and where you're effectively trying to gather assets from very wealthy people and manage them as part of your team. Which was interesting. So, as a young rep in that kind of role, what you start doing is try and emulate those who are successful. And so what happened among the reps within my group was everyone bought tailored suits. Everyone bought really nice shoes. I ditched my 91 Camry for a used Audi, which was much more respectable if you were going to show up and ask someone for their trust to manage their assets. As young reps, we did all of the things that the successful managers did. I went to polo matches. I went to art shows, which were cool. I really specifically remember an interesting lunch that I had with this older woman who was multi-generational wealth who lived in Nob Hill. And it was super fun, like in the reality TV kind of way. Like I'm sitting there in this, like learning about her life. And by the way, I'm sure it was mutual. because there was not an authentic connection between the two of us. I was trying to be someone that I was not at all, which was when I had sort of the authenticity aha moment, which was in order for me to be successful, even in this job that I didn't like there was no way that I was going to do that pretending that I was someone else. And so what I did was I shifted my practice at that time, and what I started doing was working with entrepreneurs who were normal, and ended up being really successful. And interestingly, we totally related, and I ended up being the most successful rep in my class. And what that means is I gathered the most assets. But at the same time, I was miserable. And I did it for 2 years, and then one fateful breakfast in Palo Alto, I broke. I had breakfast with a repeat entrepreneur. I wish I could remember his name. And he spoke with such passion about his first company, which was a molecular something that he started, and then this other company, which was this other biotech thing that I didn't understand. But he had such passion and fire about what he was doing, and it was a level of fire and heart that I hadn't felt in the 2 years that I was at Morgan Stanley. And so I got in my car, and this sounds totally cliche, but I started crying, and I cried my way back up to San Francisco. And I called my husband, and I apologized, and I said, I know we don't have a ton of money in the bank, but I'm quitting. I can't do this. I've got to love what I do. Money isn't enough. And that month I quit my job. And so, interestingly, 2 years after business school, I'm jobless. I have no idea what I want to do. I think technology is really interesting. I was in politics, and then in PR, and then this weird investment management thing. And I thought, I don't actually know who's going to take someone like me. But I found the chutzpah to believe that they would. And I came up with what my criteria was for what that next move, the next move that I'm going to make. And it was pretty simple. I was looking at startups between 3 people and 20. Sort of gave myself some boundaries. I didn't have enough confidence to think that I could be a founder, but I wanted to still be in the early build phase. And I asked these 3 questions. One is, do I buy what we're doing? Do I buy that it can be something significant and make a difference? And for those of you that have interviewed with startups or have started your own company, well, if you've started it, you believe it already. If you've interviewed, you talk to these founders and you're like, oh, I don't really know if podcasting is the new thing in media. So 1 is, do I buy it? 2 is, do I like these people? Again, at that size of an organization, it is a really unpleasant way to live if you don't enjoy the people that you're working with, because you are working so much and it is so intense and there's very few places to hide. Unlike Trulia. So come now. You can hide everywhere. But at 12 people, you can't hide. You can't hide. And then the 3rd one is, can I be myself? Because increasingly through this path, I started thinking that I think that's how I can be the best, the most powerful me, is when I can be successful being the version of Heather that I am today versus a version that I was trying to create. And so I went to Trulia. When I started, we had 12 people, and I absolutely loved it. Loved every second. We worked all the time with a team of inspiring people on a site that looked totally shitty at the time, but we believed it would be awesome, right? We believed that we could be game-changing, and the combination of believing in the cause and the people that I worked with and being able to be the authentic me worked. And so a little bit over a year after I started, I became a mom. And I was scared shitless. Because until then, my answer to any work problem was, I'm going to throw hours at it. It's the easiest solution, right? I'm smart. I don't know it. I can work all night and I'll figure it out by morning. And I thought, how do I transition from this like work my ass off chick to a work my ass off chick with kids? And I didn't know the answer. And now, 2 kids and a pregnancy later, as I reflect back, one thing that I did was I sort of took my cues from this guy named Sami Inkinen. So a lot of you guys here know him because he's the co-founder of Trulia. He's a semi-professional athlete who wins Ironmans. I mean, who wins Ironmans? I mean, and I observed, when people looked at him, people always said, "How do you do it?" And there's a lot, like Forbes has written a big spread on him. People love people like Sami because they are doing this amazing thing as a semi-professional athlete, and they're working as co-founders within this startup. How do you do it? And upon reflection, I actually don't think it's that different than trying to be a working mom. And so when I think about Sami had a crew of people that enabled him to be as good as he was. He has a bike trainer, and he's got a running trainer, and he's got a spouse who's wildly supportive of his goals that enables him to do it. And trying to be successful as a working mom is not dissimilar to that. You can't do it alone. So whether it's family or babysitters or nanny shares or a spouse or whatever it is, one key to being successful, I 100% agree with Sheryl Sandberg on this one, is the most important decision you make is who's your partner. Because that in a lot of ways makes or breaks you. So don't do it alone. Number 2 is define your boundaries. So Sami never stayed at a Trulia party past 8 p.m. Right? He never drank. When he was training, he never attended a meeting before 9 a.m. because he made time for the things that mattered to him. He defined the boundaries. Because if you don't define the boundaries, as we all know, you can work all night, every night, and have enough to do. But how he was successful at both was by ensuring that he made the time for both. And so I think about my girlfriend, Kara Nortman, who's a VP at IAC, or was a VP at IAC, then went on to be a general manager at CitySearch, helped build and launch Urban Spoon, and now 6 months pregnant with her 3rd kid, just quit to start her own company with Punky Brewster. Not kidding. Not kidding. That's a true story. Soleil Moon Fry. And when she had her first kid, she called me and she's like, "Do you think that I can make it to music class on Thursdays?" And I was like, "Are you kidding me? You're running this huge organization. You're going to go to music class?" And she pulled it off. It's something that's important to her. And so the way she did it was on Thursdays, she blocked her calendar from 10 to 11:30, and she goes to music class. Again, not everyone has the luxury to make these decisions. I think a lot of us do. And it works for Sami, and it can work for us. And then the third one is don't hide it. So, as a professional athlete, this one's a little bit easier because everyone thinks you're super badass. And as a working mom, it's a little bit less badass, right? And you're more worried about all of the stigma of you not working hard enough or whatever it is. But what I have found is hiding it only makes it harder for me. I'm still doing the same work, but I have the pain of trying to hide that I'm actually have these other things that I care about. Sami doesn't hide it. He carries his bike around the office all the time, shows up in his Trulia tighties, and it's fine. And so an example of this is when I first came back to work after my first kid, our first week back was a trip to Tahoe, a Tahoe offsite. And for those of you that are familiar with what happens when you're a nursing mom, there are things that you have to do. And I thought, how am I going to do this? Every 3 hours I need to leave the room, and I'm at an offsite with 25 people, and how am I going to pull that off? And what I did was, Pete and Sami, both married today, at the time, both swinging singles. Dating like crazy, marriage furthest thing from their mind, and I was the first woman at Trulia to have a kid. And frankly, the men at Trulia who had kids prior to me were like so committed because they went to the hospital, worked at the hospital, and were in the office the next day. So I was like, how is this going to go? I don't know how this is going to work. And so I pulled Pete aside, and I'm like, I'm not going to get specific, but I've got to leave every 3 hours. And I'm sorry to make you uncomfortable. I wasn't sure like how to hide it. So I just wanted to let you know. And so he was super uncomfortable. Super. And he said, great, and he walked away. And I think, as I think about the principles, and a bunch of the Trulians asked me this, like, how do you make it work? I mean, I thought about Sami, and I do think a lot of these same principles apply. So back to Trulia. For my first 5 years at Trulia, I ran consumer and corporate marketing and PR. But what I really did as an early employee at Trulia was I was an early business leader within the org. And I really liked that. And a year after the birth of my second kid, so we're now 5 years into Trulia, we were doing really well. We brought the company from 20,000 visits a day to 1 million visits a day. We went from like a really, really no brand to a brand that people heard about, especially people who were engaged in real estate. And we had 200 people. And what happens at an org at roughly that size is people on functional teams are more functional. Like you're doing more of your functional role. And what I found for me was I found myself reflecting, I found myself thinking, I think there are other people who would love this job more and be better at it. Because what I realized was I wasn't actually in love with doing the marketing, I was in love with being in the business. And so the great benefit of being at a startup early is you get the opportunity to do things that you are entirely unqualified to do. Ruth, for example. And so at the time, Ruth is badass, by the way, but unqualified when she first got the job, and now everything. And so we were hiring for a VP of inside sales. And we were looking for someone with 20 years of experience managing inside sales teams, growing organizations, and I obviously have none of that. I worked in sales once at Morgan Stanley, and I hated it. And I raised my hand, and I said, I want that job. And thanks to my credibility internally and what I'd been able to accomplish, they gave it to me. And so for you guys, as you think about, am I done with this job? Is it time for me to leave? I am so thankful that I stayed at Trulia for the time that I did, because it gave me the opportunity, and especially if you're at a company that's continuing to grow and scale, opportunity that you wouldn't otherwise have, no matter your function. And then as things would have it, because life is funny, we had an org change, and then 3 months later, I became the effective GM of the group, running our agent services business. And I can honestly say I think I have one of the coolest jobs in-house, other than all of you guys from Trulia. And I love it. And so in closing, I want to spend one more minute or a few more minutes talking about authenticity. Because as I think about over the past 10 years, the insight that's helped driven sort of my most important decisions, it really is sort of my beliefs and feelings around this authenticity thing. And so what is authenticity? I'm sure there's a better definition by people who write definitions, but this is how I think about it. It's part realness, wholeness, and transparency. On realness, I can think of no better definition than like 90s hip hop and keeping it real, right? Like when I was at that meeting with the woman on Nob Hill, like I was very cognizant of the fact that I was not keeping it real. It was not a real, we didn't have a real connection. I wasn't being myself. And the ability to be yourself and still be successful and enjoy yourself, I think is a big part of how I like to live life. Second is wholeness. You could be really great at your job, whether you're a programmer or in sales ops or wherever you are. But you're so much more interesting when you're a whole person, right? Because you also like to ski, and you also love dogs, and you also do all of these other things that make you a more interesting person. And being able to be that person both at work as well as in the rest of your life is just a more joyful experience, in my opinion. And then finally, transparency. People are afraid of transparency, because it's a little bit scary being vulnerable. I get it. But I think there's nothing more powerful than not having to hide anything about who you are. And so don't get me wrong, you can be wildly successful without being authentic. And there are examples everywhere in the news. So this is not like Heather's recipe for how you must be successful. It's just how I want to be successful. And I'm just righteous enough for myself, and I hope you're righteous enough for yourselves, that I want to be successful the way I want to do it. And so, but I do think that authenticity creates a few specific things in the workplace. And I think I put it here. Yes, authenticity at work. So number one, I think practicing authenticity at work, I think it makes you more powerful. Like I said, people are afraid of being transparent because it makes them vulnerable. But when you have nothing to hide, it increases your power. And I think people respect you for it. 2, and I feel so new agey with this whole thing, but it's more fun. Like, there's nothing more fun than not being apologetic about who you are. And if you can actually pull that off, and have an awesome job that you love, why wouldn't you do that? And third, and this is specifically in the work context, I think that you have more enthusiastic work relationships when you practice a more authentic way of living. I think that affection and loyalty and enthusiasm in the workplace increases as you have a more authentic relationship with one another. And so I just want to leave you with a thought, authenticity at work is a practice. And so maybe you guys buy what I'm slanging, or maybe you don't. But I ask you to think about it. And think about, when you're in a meeting and putting up a front, and ask yourself, do I actually have to do that? Or can I approach this as me and be equally successful, but do it in a way that is actually more fun for you? My bet is that you try it and you like it. That's it. So if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything you got about anything. Or we can just chit-chat. Yeah?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
I see this as part of startups all the time, that people, it's very hard to go from being a business leader in an early startup and still be it when someone IPOs. So executives in early startup always okay, they're not fit when the startup grows, and then again you bring in more seasoned people. So how did you how did you get yourself up in the challenge? Did you have to develop yourself more in skills, and how did you beat it? Because I always find ourselves asking, do we want more 10 years, more experience at this point, and stuff like that?
I should confess that I probably have a clinical case of imposter syndrome, right? So my self-doubt is wildly high. And so to your question of how did I sort of make that transition, I did it with a lot of self-doubt to start. And if I can point to my WIM group, like I sort of brought it to that table and was like, I don't know that I can do this job. And sort of through that feedback, as well as another thing that happens at startups is you start bringing people in with the experience and the resume that you're looking for, and they fail. And so I have the good fortune of having observed that as well. And so I think the combination of being able to just be honest, that like, can I really do this job? Be honest and sort of manage that doubt that I had, as well as observations that just because you come in with 10 years of experience, actually, or 10 or 20 or whatever it is, that doesn't actually make you successful at the role. That's how I personally manage it. And then I think in terms of my business function, what I did was I was very transparent about what I knew and what I didn't know. And so I hired functional heads across my organization who know their functions incredibly well. And so for me to enable me to do my job, I need to make sure that I had someone who actually has run a sales team for a really long time and made all those decisions around, are we going to outsource or not? And what is our compensation structure? And how should we think about all these things? And I could say that same story across the various businesses that report in, or the various functions that report into me. And so I think there's also just a willingness to recognize what you know and what you don't know, and then hire your weakness. Adriana?
So I have two observations.
Yeah.
Thank you to the male Trulians that are here.
Woo woo!
I was actually quite surprised when Elise had to make a clarification.
Yeah.
That this talk was for male
yeah.
Trulians as well.
Yeah.
So I was like, why the need?
Yeah.
That's one observation. Then this morning I was with Kathy, and we remember Cheryl's talk about sitting at the table. And like we were talking about this, we were thinking about the same thing at the same time, and we were like, we're at the table, swing shots, right?
Yep.
So it's still a male environment, and Trulia is a male environment, and you're the only women in senior management.
Mm-hmm.
Question: how does that feel? And second question: how can we change that?
Well, I don't like it at all. That part. I love this company. And for those of you that are not working at Trulia, I was the only VP when we had 5 people on the management team. And through really rapid growth, we now have 18 people on the management team, and I remain the only female. And I think that I think there are 2 sides to this, right? One, because I'm so self-helpy, there's sort of the my joy piece, and it reduces my joy. Like, I'm not going to lie. Because I think there's a dynamic when you have men and women in a room that's different than when it's all women or when it's all men. I would be equally annoyed, I think, if it were all women, right? And so there's a Heather's joy piece that, to be very candid with you, I've struggled with over time. And then there's a business piece, which we thankfully have a management team that recognizes that it is a problem, right? Because 70% of our users, our consumers, are women, and 70% of our customers are women. And so it does not take someone who is burning her bra to say, we actually should have more women at this table. And so your next question might be, why don't we? And I can tell you that I don't think at all that it's by design. I think what happens in a lot of these organizations is you bring people in by referral. You have expectations around, it is easier to believe there is competence when someone is more like you. It doesn't mean that you think women are incompetent, as an example. But if I am a very linear male who thinks a certain way, and another linear male who walks by and we're talking about an important problem, I'm like, oh my God, he's so smart. Because we connect. And I think a little bit of that has happened through our rapid growth. But I can report to you that this is something that I've had very direct conversations with our senior management team and certainly our 3 top execs, and they identify it as a real problem, and how we change it, it's by hiring women. And as I think about hiring women, this is why do you guys remember when Romney talked about the binders full of women and everyone thought he was bullshit? I was like, I love this guy, right? I'm like, give me some binders. Because if I had more female candidates at the senior level at Trulia, if I had a better pipeline, we would have more people converting to the management team. And you can criticize Romney and say he didn't really have a binder and he really hates women or whatever you think about him. But the reality is, like, it's identifying that it is often a pipeline problem, 1. And then 2, there might be a problem around what I said is that sameness bias, both of which have been recognized.
Me and Heather actually talked about this the first time we met, and it's like I see it in a startup all the time. Like you just get very few female candidates, and so now I'm surrounded by like 95% men, and you're always trying to hire the best, and then by default, like unless you don't make an extra effort to hire more women, it just doesn't come in the picture, you know. And now I've started realizing, oh, it'd be great to have like 1 woman here, so let's make more of an effort to source more women candidates, and you know, it takes. It's so easily a default, right?
Yeah, it happens very rapidly without noticing.
Exactly.
Until it becomes a problem.
How do you deal with the sameness bias that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Like as an external candidate who interviews with, say, a company and understands that there is some sameness bias, how do you deal with that?
As the candidate?
Because you can't really do much about it, or probably you can, I don't know.
Yeah. I think as the candidate coming to a company where you see that there might be a bit of the sameness happening on the team, I think it's like anything else. If you want to be heard, you've got to speak in the language that works for your recipient. And so if you recognize that, for example, it's a linear male environment, I might orient my responses in a way that are more linear. But as an example, right? So like, I'll tell you, this has happened to me over time, right? There have been times at Trulia where I'm sitting at the table, and at Trulia and other places, this is not specific to Trulia, where I'll say something, and then the guy to my right will say the exact same thing, and then everyone nods. And I'm like what just happened? And like the first few times you ignore it, because you're like, wow, maybe that was me. And then the next couple, I got pissed. And I was like, thank you, Emmanuel, for saying exactly what I just said. But the part, I hate to call him out, but the part that I need to own was there was something about my delivery which people had a hard time receiving, right? And so part of how I modified my style when I'm in certain meetings is I'll lower my voice. I'll talk more slowly. I won't like, because I think when you do that, people are like, they're not listening. Or at least that was my observation. So I like reflect my communication style in a way that can be absorbed. And I think that's a relevant comment for any particular kind of environment. Ruthie, do you have a question? Done. Yeah, Pat.
Question. It's not about women.
Not about girls?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It seems like you've had a pretty windy or less linear road to getting where you have gotten.
Yeah.
And I think with people, certainly sort of in my demographic, the idea is you sort of want to keep building blocks to get to eventually where you want to get.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, having gone to GSB and then going to Morgan Stanley and then, you know, taking a completely different road and going to work for a technology company, which you've never done before.
Yeah.
It was a bit of a risk, right? And do you think that sort of taking that risk was what got you to where you were? As you compare yourself to your peers who maybe took the more linear path, do you think you're better off or worse off, or it does not really matter as long as you find, or as long as you get lucky, maybe?
You call me lucky? No talent? So when I was at Morgan Stanley, I observed a lot of the female leaders at Morgan Stanley, and I thought I should want to be them. I remember spending quite a lot of time thinking, like, I've taken this path, I'm actually quite good at it. Like, look at that woman. She's pretty awesome. I could probably be her, and I should probably want to. But I think the reality is, for me, that would have never happened. Because there is something about, at least the way I choose to live my life, that I've got to have the combination of something that I love and have passion around, and that reflects itself in the work that I do. And so for me personally, it was the no-brainer solution. Now, I took a $100,000 pay cut to get here, and I might have been making more money over time, but I wasn't optimizing for that. I was optimizing for, like, where can I make the biggest contribution and love it? And so I guess as I look at some of my colleagues who took a more linear path, I mean, it's a mixed bag. You know, I've got plenty of friends who went the consulting path and they're now partners at McKinsey and BCG and Bain. And are they better off? I mean, depends. If you love it, that's great. And if you don't, I would argue that you're worse off. So I wouldn't be afraid, Pat, of bouncing. You know, I think taking the risk. Don't
Here's my 2 week notice.
He just started on Monday, by the way. So no, I didn't mean bounce from Trulia, but I meant consider various functions, right? Like, you are a super smart, worked at a venture capital firm, super analytical guy. But as you spend time at Trulia, if you find that the more creative side of marketing is interesting, like, maybe you should give it a shot. And I think what I showed through my 2 years at Morgan Stanley is it was a slight detour. I learned a lot about myself and what I want to do and the things that fire me up that have now contributed to where I am today. So I don't at all think of that as wasted time. Whereas I think in the moment, I did have quite a lot of thoughts of, oh my God, I've just wasted the past 2 years. I mean, who cares? 2 years. It's nothing, right? You got a lifetime of mistakes to make.
Can I speak as someone who knew better at Morgan Stanley?
Yes!
I'll fess up to that. But she made the change at the right time, which was young and didn't have the heavy commitments of family and mortgages. And all that. So you got to do it.
That's a good point. That's a good point. It makes it harder.
Yeah. You have an interesting dichotomy of someone who will like think something out all the way through, and also take some really big risks.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of that internal dialogue you have when you decide to make a risk? Is it purely just a guttural emotional feeling, or is it something that you still try to figure out and know that you can handle that risk that you're prepared to make? With the exception of moving to Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I was 21, super fun.
Exactly. Like for the future from here on.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm in a different world today, right? I have 2 kids. I have a mortgage. But I wouldn't say, so my risk profile has changed, but I wouldn't say some of the principles that I just shared are any different, right? Like, if I find that I am not loving what I'm doing, I still believe that I will be better at a job where I love it. And so, unlike Morgan Stanley, where I'll cry from Palo Alto to San Francisco and quit my job, I might not do it that rapidly, but I would still make that change. And even when I did, you know, I was going to be able to get a job, right? When I made the post-Morgan Stanley change. So I was not worried about going broke. Now, I might have had a lame job, but thanks to all the stuff that I've done, I could go like do PR for someone. I could go, there's a bunch of stuff I could do, so I'd be able to put food on the table. And I guess as we all get older with more of those commitments, you've just got to put more of that into place. But I still believe that you can figure out a way to work it out. I don't believe you're locked in. My friend Karen Ortman, right? 2 kids, 1 on the way, quit her job, start up with Punky Brewster. I was like, what are you doing? She's like, it's the right thing to do. And she is one of the most logical, analytical people that you've ever met. So yes, it gets harder, but you can still manage the trade-offs, in my opinion. Yeah.
All right, so you talked a lot about authenticity.
Yeah.
And I I'm struggling with the idea a little bit.
Yeah.
I think we, especially as women, and when we look at women in leadership positions, I don't want to say they fit a stereotype or a mold, but they kind of, they're bold, they're powerful, they oftentimes have made changes to adapt to their environment of working with all men. How do we stay authentic if we feel like we need to mold to being that type of person to move up?
I mean, it's a good
If
question.
you aren't that
Yeah.
type of person
Like
already.
changing your voice.
Yeah, my tone.
your meaning.
Yeah. I mean, that's simply me wanting to be heard.
Right.
So I hear your conflict with it. Let me see if I can help. Like when I'm in the Philippines, I talk with a Filipino accent because they can hear me better. They can understand what I'm saying better. And I guess in a way I don't feel like that's me being inauthentic. I'm like, you can just understand me better when I talk in a way that you can hear. Right? But part of my authenticity in the workplace is ensuring that it's clear that I think our gender imbalance is off. Right? I don't accept that as this is the way it is. So I guess my authenticity comes out in that I can talk about that. In the example where Emmanuel said the same thing that I said, and everyone understood him, I mean, part of what my keeping it real is saying, like, someone help me understand why he just said what I said, but you heard him, and you guys couldn't hear me. Everyone was like, oh, Heather's being weird. Everyone got a little scared. But I was like, someone help me understand this. And that's part of me being real. But to be a professional, certain things do need to conform. So I'm not saying that like this authenticity notion means we're all wearing t-shirts and flip-flops with hairy toes. You know, like there is some level of being appropriate to whatever the function is or whatever the role is, but it's doing it in a way that feels good, right? And sort of enables you to be more whole. Does that help? You want me to do my Filipino accent again?
Yeah.
Anything else, guys? What's up, Rishi?
So what's next for you?
Oh, I'm not going anywhere. What do you mean?
Where do you want to go career-wise?
Career-wise?
Yeah. Where do you see yourself?
So I've thought about a lot of things. Like, I'm not going to lie, the whole Sheryl Sandberg thing is like, can I be a Sheryl Sandberg? Like, she's kind of awesome. And so, like, will I remain in a revenue-centric function at public companies? That's a pretty interesting road with lots of really great opportunities, starting with staying here for a long time, of course. I've also thought about starting my own gig. There is a part of me that has a bit of an entrepreneur's bug. So I would not be surprised if I did that as well. But I don't really have a path, to be honest. You know, like my path sort of stopped when I ended on the McCain campaign. Because until then, I was like, politics, I'm going to go do this. And Ed Rollins was this like gun-slanging politico. And I'm like, I want to be him when I grew up. And once I left in 2000, I didn't really have a path anymore. Like at that point, the way I think about it is like, what's the next decision that gives me the most option value for the thing I want to do next? That's fun. Yeah, Andrew.
Did you have like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan at any point?
Yeah, when I was 21. And it lasted 3 years. Then, and then it was over.
And you never felt like a need for it since then?
No. I feel very compelled to do things that increase my options, and that I enjoy. And I feel like, and I've observed this with a lot of my peers, you can meander your way there and get new experiences along the way. I mean, maybe if I had a better plan, I wouldn't have gone to Morgan Stanley. No offense. Yeah. It was a blast. Yeah, no. I'm not that worried about a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. I mean, I'm shocked that I'm a mom of 3 kids. I will be a mom of 3 kids. Like, I didn't plan that. I'm shocked. Kathy?
So I really like your point about confidence in relationships and how that magnifies confidence. And I think at least kind of early in your career, early in my career, I kind of value confidence because it's the thing that I can control. It's the thing that I can like follow a certain path and get better at.
Yeah.
Can you talk about relationships and whether that was something that you felt like came naturally to you or that you developed over time, and like kind of the role that played with the confidence? Like me, both, but like kind of how did that evolve for you?
Yeah. So I like people, right? And so that's sort of like, is it natural, is it not? I actually enjoy knowing about Steve Chu's dogs that he told me about over lunch the other day, and so I think to that point, like, there is a bit of it, it does come naturally to me that I enjoy the people side of life. I think it is a bit harder and my husband, by the way, is a total introvert. Right, like I send him meeting requests for events to hang out with our friends, and he like declines me all the time. Yeah, declines. Yeah, outright. So I observe his side where like we'll go to a party and I get tons of energy from the people there, and I go home and I'm like, oh my god, that was so awesome. And he goes home and he like lays on the couch and he like can't move because that was so draining for him. And so I think it's harder if you fall closer to that camp. And for me, the balance now, like, and I'm sure you guys have all heard of all these people, like, build your contacts and here are all the things that you should do in order to network. And like, I think there's a line where it sort of gets gross. And back to my, like, little authenticity spiel. Like, I feel like do it in a way that is enjoyable for you and helps you grow, being cognizant that relationships matter, right? Like, I picked Stanford over other schools because I believe the relationships matter. I don't feel bad about that. But, it is a balance, right? Like, you go too far in that spectrum, and oftentimes your competence is questioned. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question. Yeah?
Do you have any tactics about how introverts can deal with managing relationships from what you have seen?
Marry an extrovert. It's fun.
I done that.
You did?
But I still don't know how to build relationships. That's actually hard for an introvert.
Yeah.
Have you seen how your husband does it, or any lessons?
So I know my tactics to get him. So I can share with you my tactics that maybe you can share with your partner. So one is I never bring him to a big group where he's not going to know a lot of people, because that is like his worst nightmare, and it is entirely unsuccessful for him to build any kind of relationships or have fun in that environment. So when I know, so for example, I actually did this in business school. I was dating my husband back then, and I was like, this is going to be horrible. Like, he's like, business school is a very heavy party meeting kind of environment. And so what I did was early on, I identified people that I thought would be my friends. It's hard to know. And I did small dinners. I did small meetings where like you build smaller relationships, smaller group relationships that are authentic, which then enabled him to go to the 500-person party and actually enjoy himself.
Yeah.
And so I'm imagining it's the same for you. So maybe for you, it's okay that you don't like to be in a group with 300 people. But make the effort to do the lunch with 4, and do enough of those that you're building the kind of relationships that are meaningful for you personally and professionally.
That makes sense.
That's my advice. Thanks, guys, for listening for so long. I appreciate you all sitting here. I'll hang out for a minute if anyone has anything else. I hope we got something. It was somewhat useful. All right, guys, have an awesome night. Thank you.
We had Heather's talk on storylineschapter.org. I'll send a link out to the group as well.